Hello and welcome to Synthetic History, where the past speaks again, but not through dusty archives or faded manuscripts. Here, we use generative AI tools to resurrect history's lost stories, forgotten places, silenced voices, and the echoes of time itself. This isn't just storytelling, it's a collaboration between human researchers and AI agents, weaving together historical fact and imagination with precision. Every episode is a bridge between what was and what could be remembered. And now, let's begin. Here's our new episode.
Part 1, The Council Fire. The flames danced in Sachem Konkapot's eyes as he gazed into the council fire. For 4 days, the Mohican leaders had debated their future, weighing a decision that would alter the course of their people forever. The colonists were pressing in from all sides, and survival hung in the balance. Konkapot's voice cuts through the night. We cannot defeat them, so we must join them. A murmur rippled through the gathered Sachems. Umpachene, the eldest among them, leaned forward, his face etched with concern. Join them and lose ourselves in the process? Konkapot shook his head, his eyes never leaving the fire. Number, we will become Christians. We will learn their ways, but we will remain Mohican in our hearts. This is how we will endure. The debate continued long into the night. Some Sachems argued passionately against embracing the colonists' religion, fearing it would erase their identity as Muhikon-Neok, the people of the waters that are never still. Others recognized the pragmatic wisdom in Konkapot's words. Their numbers were dwindling, their traditional hunting grounds shrinking. Perhaps adaptation was their only hope of survival. As dawn broke on the 4th day, wampum was exchanged. The covenant was sealed. The Mohicans would walk a new path, one that promised both salvation and peril. Konkapot, known among colonists for his good character and disposition towards Christianity, had made a decision that would echo through generations.
Part 2, The Missionaries' Arrival. John Sargent stepped off the boat onto Mohican soil, his heart racing with anticipation. The young Yale graduate had dreamed of this moment, the chance to bring Christianity to the savages and prove himself worthy of his calling. But as he gazed at the faces of the Mohican people gathered to greet him, Sargent felt a flicker of doubt. These were not the simple barbarians he had imagined. Their eyes held wisdom, wariness, and a deep connection to the land that made him feel like the outsider he truly was. Konkapot approached, his bearing regal despite the strain of recent years. "Welcome, John Sargent," he said in careful English. "We have agreed to hear your teachings, but know this. We are not empty vessels waiting to be filled. We have our own spirits, our own ways. Do you come to learn as well as teach?" Sargent swallowed hard, realizing the magnitude of the task before him. "I do," he replied, praying his voice didn't betray his uncertainty. As he followed Konkapot into the village, Sargent couldn't shake the feeling that he was stepping into a story far larger and more complex than he had ever imagined. The mission had been authorized by Governor Jonathan Belcher and the Commissioners for Indian Affairs in Boston, who had granted him a salary of £100 per year, a considerable sum that reflected the importance colonial authorities placed on converting the native population. That night, in the temporary lodging prepared for him, Sargent wrote in his journal by candlelight, "These people possess a dignity I had not expected. Their leader Konkapot challenges me to understand before I instruct. I pray I am worthy of this task." Part 3, 2 villages become one. The bitter winter wind cut through Sargent's coat as he trudged through knee-deep snow. The 8-mile journey between the 2 Mohican settlements, Skatehook to the south where Lieutenant Umpachene lived, and Renaktukuk to the north where Captain Konkapot resided, had become a weekly pilgrimage. Timothy Woodbridge, the schoolmaster who had been enlisted to assist in the mission, approached on horseback from the opposite direction. "Another week, another crossing," Woodbridge called out, his breath visible in the cold air. Sargent nodded wearily. "This cannot continue. The children at Skatehook learn their letters one day, only to forget them by the time I return. And those at Renaktukuk hear the gospel in fragments. I've been thinking," Woodbridge said, dismounting to walk alongside Sargent, "what if we didn't have to choose between the settlements? What if they could become one? The idea took root. When spring came, Sargent travelled to Boston to meet with Governor Belcher. The governor proved receptive, proposing to the General Assembly that a township be granted the mission, allowing the entire tribe to live together. On March 25th, 1736, the township, initially called simply Indiantown, was granted. The Mohicans from both villages would relocate to this new settlement, alongside 4 English families permitted under the terms of the grant. As the first permanent house in the new settlement took shape, built by Woodbridge, who had recently married, Sargent watched with a mixture of hope and trepidation. In January 1737, he moved in with the Woodbridges, while his own home was being constructed. By April, the mission house, which still stands today, was completed, becoming a physical symbol of the experiment unfolding in this remote corner of Massachusetts.
Part 4. A Daughter's Dilemma. Annick stood at the edge of the forest, her heart torn between 2 worlds. Behind her lay Stockbridge, the experiment that had consumed her people for nearly 2 decades. Before her stretched the wild lands that called to her blood, whispering of a freedom long forgotten. She closed her eyes, remembering her father's words on his deathbed, "Guard our ways, daughter. The white man's path is treacherous." But how could she guard what was already slipping away? The Mohican language faded from young lips, replaced by the harsh sounds of English. Traditional dress gave way to colonial fashions, and the land, their sacred connection to the earth itself, was being parceled and sold piece by piece. The death of Reverend Sargent the previous year had changed everything. Their champion was gone, taking with him the promise of true partnership between Mohican and English. His replacement, the stern theologian Jonathan Edwards, lacked Sargent's deep connection to the Mohican people. A twig snapped behind her. Annick whirled, hand instinctively reaching for a knife no longer at her hip. Hendrik Aupalmut emerged from the shadows, his eyes sharp despite his youth. "You feel it too," he said softly, the noose tightening. Annick nodded, studying the young man who had become a voice of warning among their people. "What would you have us do, Hendrik? Abandon all we've built here?" Aupalmut's gaze swept over Stockbridge, taking in the white steeple of the church, the neat rows of English-style homes built on land that had been promised to the Mohicans in perpetuity, yet was increasingly being seized by unscrupulous whites, including Ephraim Williams, the father-in-law of their former missionary. "Not abandon," he said slowly, "but prepare. Learn their ways, their laws, for only by mastering their game can we hope to survive it." As the sun set behind them, casting long shadows across the land, Annick felt the weight of history settling on her shoulders. The choices she and her generation made would shape the destiny of the Mohican people for centuries to come. Part 5. The Winds of Change. The French and Indian War brought new upheavals to Stockbridge. Mohican men donned British uniforms, fighting alongside colonial troops against the French and their native allies. They left as warriors and returned as veterans, only to find more of their land had been sold in their absence. By 1763, with the war's end, white settlers encroached even more aggressively on Mohican land. In Stockbridge, they began changing local governance and pushing out tribal leadership. The promises of partnership and equality that had founded Stockbridge were crumbling. Annick, now a respected voice among her people, watched as the delicate balance in Stockbridge began to tilt irreversibly. The town that had once been hailed as a model of integration, where Indians and whites shared power in town government, was becoming just another colonial settlement. "We appealed to the British government in London," Hendrik Aupalmut told the tribal council, his voice tight with suppressed anger. "Our petitions went unanswered." "And what of these colonial protests we hear about?" asked an elder. "These complaints about taxation without representation?" Aupalmut's eyes gleamed. "They protest the very thing they have done to us. They speak of liberty while denying it to others." Yet despite this bitter irony, the Stockbridge Mohicans found common cause with the colonial opposition. They participated in boycotts of British goods and voiced support for colonial grievances, hoping this alliance would help protect their remaining land and sovereignty. "We must adapt," Anekshek told the council, her voice firm despite the ache in her heart. "But we must not forget who we are." Opelmuk nodded in agreement. "Knowledge is power. We will learn their ways, their laws, and we will use that knowledge to protect our people." But even as they spoke, forces beyond their control were shaping the future. To the east, tensions between the colonies and Britain were reaching a boiling point. War was coming, and once again, the Mohicans would be caught in the middle.
Part 6. Revolutionary Choices. In the autumn of 1774, as communities across Massachusetts organised their militia companies, the Mohican leaders of Stockbridge gathered in solemn council. The decision before them was momentous. Which side would they support in the brewing conflict between Britain and its colonies? Solomon Wahaunwanwaumeet, a respected sachem, rose to address the council. "Brothers," he began, his voice carrying across the hushed gathering, "you remember when they first came over the great waters. I was great and they were very little. I then took them in for a friend and kept them under my arm so that no one might injure them." He paused, his eyes sweeping over the assembly. "But now our conditions are changed. They have become great and tall, and I have become small. Now they take care of me, and I look to them for protection." The decision was made. The Stockbridge would stand with the colonists in hopes that this allegiance would protect their land and sovereignty. Solomon's promise echoed through the hall. "Wherever you go, we will be by your sides. Our bones shall die with yours. We are determined never to be at peace with the Redcoats, while they are at variance with you." When news reached Stockbridge of shots fired at Lexington and Concord in April 1775, dozens of Mohican men immediately joined the New England Minutemen rushing to the scene. In what became known as Battle Road, Mohican and American soldiers lined the path connecting Concord, Lexington, and Boston, pouring incessant fire upon the British Army. From there, the Stockbridge Indian Company marched to Cambridge, where thousands of militiamen besieged the British Army within Boston. For 10 months, the Mohican built siege fortifications, patrolled the outer defences and conducted periodic ambushes of British forces. John Quinney, who had just turned 18 when the war began, stood among the Mohican warriors as they prepared for battle. "We fight for their freedom," he said to Anekshek, now a respected elder. "But what of our own?" Anekshek's eyes were weary, but her voice remained strong. "We fight because it is who we are, warriors, protectors of this land, whether they acknowledge it or not." The war raged on, and the Mohicans of Stockbridge distinguished themselves in battle after battle. They bled for the American cause, believing that their loyalty would finally earn them the respect and equality they had long been promised.
Part 7. Betrayal at Valley Forge. The winter at Valley Forge had been brutal. Thousands of Continental Army soldiers had died of cold, disease, and starvation. The Stockbridge men, accustomed to harsh winters, had fared better than most, but they too felt the bite of hunger and the sting of despair. John Quinney stood in General Washington's headquarters, his breath visible in the frigid air. He had been summoned to translate for a delegation of Mohican leaders who had traveled from Stockbridge with a petition. Washington listened intently as Quinney translated the sachem's words. "We have been defrauded of our lands. We fight now for the colonists' cause, but we ask for assurances that our land rights will be vindicated." The general's face revealed nothing as he considered their words. Finally, he spoke. "Tell your people that we are grateful for their service. The Congress and I promise to protect you to the utmost of our power." As Quinney translated, he noticed the careful phrasing, "to the utmost of our power." Not a firm commitment, but a qualified one. Still, it was something, a promise from General Washington himself. Outside, as the delegation prepared to depart, one of the sachems, an old man with clouded eyes, gripped Quinney's arm. "Did he mean it?" the old man asked in Mohican. Quinney hesitated. "I believe he wants to," he replied finally. The old man nodded slowly. "Wants to is not the same as will." He turned his face to the sky, where snow had begun to fall again. "Remember that when the time comes?" Part 8, The Final Betrayal. The war was over. The 13 colonies had won their independence. But for the Mohicans of Stockbridge, victory tasted like ash. In 1783, John Quinney stood before the colonial magistrates, his heart pounding with a mixture of rage and disbelief. The words echoed in his ears, each syllable a hammer blow against everything his people had believed. The experiment has run its course. The Mohicans must leave Stockbridge. Quinney's mind raced, searching for the right words, the perfect argument that would make these men see reason. But as he looked into their eyes, he saw only cold calculation. The land was needed for English settlers. The Mohicans had become inconvenient. "This is our home," Quinney said, his voice steady despite the turmoil within. "We have lived here in peace, adopted your ways, fought alongside you in your wars. How can you now cast us aside?" The lead magistrate leaned forward, his tone patronizing. "Mr. Quinney, surely you understand. Progress cannot be halted. Your people will be relocated to the edge of New York. It's for the best, really." That night, Quinney walked through the town of Stockbridge, the town that had once held such promise, the great experiment that was supposed to show how Mohican and English could live side by side as equals. Now, it had become just another example of broken promises and stolen land. The Oneida, who had also fought for the colonists during the Revolutionary War, had offered the Stockbridge Mohicans a portion of their territory near Oneida Lake in western New York. It was a generous offer from fellow Native people, a stark contrast to the betrayal by those they had fought to liberate. In 1785, the Mohicans were forced to leave Stockbridge, abandoning homes, farms, and the graves of their ancestors. Once again, they would have to start over in an uncultivated wilderness. Part 9. New Stockbridge. The journey to Oneida territory was arduous. Families traveled with what few possessions they could carry, their hearts heavy with the weight of exile. But upon arrival, they set about rebuilding with characteristic resilience. They called their new settlement New Stockbridge, a name that carried both memory and hope. Once again, they cleared forests, built homes, and established a school and sawmill. The Stockbridge Indian Church moved with them, led by John Sargent the Younger, son of the original missionary who had come to them half a century before. For a time, it seemed they might find peace. Under the leadership of Hendrik Aupelmoot and other sachems, the community began to thrive once more. In 1794, the federal government even entered into a treaty with the Oneida, Tuscarora, and Stockbridge, thanking the tribes for their wartime services with a gift of $5,000. But history had a way of repeating itself. By the early 1800s, white settlers were again encroaching on their lands. The Oneida had sold much of their territory to New York State, putting pressure on the Stockbridge settlement. In 1708, John Quinney, now a tribal leader in his own right, called a council. "Our people cannot endure another displacement," argued an elder woman, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "We have built homes, farms, a church. Must we abandon everything again?" Quinney sighed, the weight of leadership heavy on his shoulders. "The tide of white settlement cannot be turned back, but perhaps we can stay ahead of it." He explained that representatives from several eastern tribes, Oneida, Stockbridge, and Brothertown, had been exploring options further west. In 1821, a delegation would travel to Green Bay, Wisconsin to purchase land from the Ho-Chunk and Menominee. Once more, we must choose. Stay and watch our world shrink around us, or go and build anew. The decision to move came slowly, painfully. By 1818, the first groups of Stockbridge Mohicans were heading west, this time to Muncie, Indiana.
Part 10. The Long Migration. The 19th century became a chronicle of continued displacement for the Stockbridge people. From New York to Indiana, from Indiana to Wisconsin, each move requiring them to abandon their newly built homes and farms to start life over again in an uncultivated wilderness. By 1822, they had established a small settlement on the Fox River, near present-day Kaukauna, Wisconsin. Here they were joined by about 100 Muncie Delaware who had previously been living in Canada. Together they became known as the Stockbridge Munsee. But the pattern continued. In 1832 they were removed to the eastern shore of Lake Winnebago, and by 1856 they had been relocated again, this time to land adjoining the Menominee Reservation near modern Bola. Through it all, Electa Quinney, granddaughter of John Quinney, emerged as a beacon of hope and resilience. Educated in Eastern schools, she returned to her people and opened a school that would become Wisconsin's first public school, preceding even Wisconsin's statehood, an achievement the tribe remembers with pride. "We have been pushed from place to place," she told her students, "but wherever we go, we carry our knowledge, our traditions, our dignity. They can take our land, but they cannot take what makes us Mohican." The General Allotment Act of 1887 brought new challenges, dividing tribal land among individuals. Many, facing desperate circumstances, sold their allotments, causing the reservation to shrink dramatically. By the early 1900s, the tribe retained only a fraction of their original territory.
Epilogue: The Unbroken Circle. Today, the Stockbridge Munsee Band of Mohican Indians maintains a reservation of approximately 24 square miles in Wisconsin. Their journey from the banks of the Hudson to the forests of Wisconsin spans nearly 3 centuries of adaptation, resistance, and survival. In the wake of the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, which returned 15,000 acres of land to the Mohicans, the tribal government was reorganized with a new constitution. Despite the hardships of forced relocations, boarding schools, and continued struggles for recognition, the community has persevered. The tribe now operates successful enterprises, including a casino that has brought economic benefits to the community. They have developed educational, health, cultural, and elder services, while also improving natural features of the area, including Many Trails Park and a wildlife sanctuary. In July 2019, direct descendants of those original Stockbridge residents returned to Massachusetts to record their stories as part of the Footprints of Our Ancestors project, bringing their history full circle. As John Quinney had known centuries before, a people's spirit cannot be broken by mere lines on a map. The journey had been long, the betrayals many, but the Mohican nation had endured. The covenant made at that council fire in 1734 had not been in vain. The saga of the Stockbridge Munsee continues, carried forward by descendants who maintain their connection to both past and future, a living testimony to the power of community to transcend even the most determined efforts at erasure.
That's it for this episode of Synthetic History. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, help us keep these forgotten voices alive by sharing the podcast on social media and with anyone who loves history told in a new way. You can find Synthetic History on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. So, be sure to subscribe, leave a review. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep the past alive. See you in the next episode.